Well, my name is Keoko, Chapter 7. Sunhee. It wasn't fair. Why couldn't girls ride bicycles? It wasn't like the old day when girls had to wear long shirts. Amoni still wore long skirts, and did a lot of older women. But young women and girls like me wore trousers. Amoni had told me that it was the Japanese who had brought this style. A lot of people hadn't liked it, but I couldn't remember why. Trousers were much easier to wear and better for playing in. I could have ridden a bicycle. It didn't look that hard. Tayu fell off a few times when he was first learning, but it wasn't long before he was able to wobble around the corner of the outer courtyard, then up and down the lane. But by the third day, he was so good at that it took him off to ride around town, and I couldn't even watch him anymore. When I turned to walk back up the path to the house, I stumbled a little stone and twisted my ankle. I crouched down and rubbed the sore spot, then stood up and kicked the stone with my other foot as hard as I could. The stone went skipping down the path. I watched until it slowed down and finally rolled to a stop. Not like Tayul on his bicycle. He wasn't very good at stopping. He always slammed on the brakes and fell off. I went to help Amoni with dinner. Abjui was listening to the radio. He and Uncle listened a lot these days. There was a war in Europe and a lot of news about a German leader named Hitler. It didn't really interest me. A strange-sounding name from a place I knew little about. When I heard it, it was just war news on the radio again. I went to the kitchen. It was my job to prepare the rice every evening. I looked in the rice barrel. Empty. I was finding it empty more and more often these days. It was because of the war, but not the one in Europe. The one in Manchuria, Japan, was at war there, fighting against the Chinese. This was why they'd taken over Korea in the first place. It was only one step from the northern border of Korea into Manchuria. The Japanese army always needed supplies. For years, they'd taken part of every rice crop to send to troops in Manchuria or to ship to Japan. Sometimes there was rice in the marketplace, and other times it was very expensive. To make it longer, Amoni had started mincing it with barley. Barley was cheaper than rice. We thought of it as food for poor people. It was chewier and coarser and had a strong flavor. Neither Tayul nor I liked barley. We used to pick it in the brownish grains and eat only the rice. But soon there was more barley than rice in our bowls. We couldn't pick it out anymore. There wouldn't have been anything left to eat. I guess you could say we got used to it. But there were still times when I missed having a whole bowl of pure white rice. Seemed we'd be having only barley tonight. I picked up the barley bag and was startled by how light it was. There wasn't enough for a meal. Amoni? I started to ask. Here, she said, handing me another bag. I opened it and looked inside. It was millet, like round yellow grains that farmers used for chicken feed. Startled, I looked up at Amoni again, and she nodded reassuringly. It's quite nutritious, she said. Who knows, perhaps it will even make a nice change. I said nothing. I could hardly believe we were eating animal food for our dinner. And as usual, I served Abjui, Uncle, and Tayul their food first. Tayul took one look at the yellow grain on his bowl and said, Amoni, what's this? It was very rude of him to comment on the food at all, and even ruder to ask such a question of Amoni. Abjui looked at him sternly. It was Uncle who answered. That's millet, nephew. Come now. Chickens and pigs love it, and I'm sure it'll be good for you, too. Uncle smiled at Tayul and took a big bite. Your mother's such a good cook, and she can make even millet taste delicious. Now, eat when you're talking and talk when you're finished. That was one of the traditional sayings. It was a good manners to pay full attention to your meal. Uncle's words had been said in his usual cheerful, joking manners, but there was a hint of warning behind them. I heard it. I knew Tayul did too, for he ate his dinner without another word. Millet had a grassy taste and felt awful in my mouth. A half mushy, half crunchy. I never got used to it, even though we had it nearly every day from then on. The bowls of yellow grain made me long for rice even more. But Omni always made our meals taste better by cooking lots of vegetables, squash, meat, potatoes, cucumbers. She was a skilled gardener, and the vegetable patch flourished no matter what the weather. I liked helping her prepare the bed, chopping and crumbling the dirt until it was like silk between my fingers, then planting the seeds or seedlings in the nice straight rows and giving each of them a drink. And later in the year, I loved it when she'd tell me to run to the garden, gather vegetables for our dinner. But I hated weeding and often found an excuse for doing something else when Amoni went out to weed. Along the back of the vegetable path was a row of small trees. Really, they were more like large shrubs. In the summer, they blossomed, big pink white-petaled flowers with magnetic throats. They were the rows of the Sharon trees, the national tree of Korea. Amoni had planted them years before, when she and Abjui first moved to this house. One evening in the fall, Uncle brought home more news. The government had issued another official order. All families who had cherry trees were to dig up shoots and saplings from around the trees and bring them to police headquarters. The little cherry trees to be planted all over town, and everyone was supposed to take good care of them. The government orders spoke of wishing to make our land more beautiful with thousands of cherry trees. But it wasn't just a wish for beauty. The cherry tree was a national symbol of Japan. And the final part of the order was that all rows of Sharon trees had to be uprooted and burned. A military police would be inspecting gardens to see that the order had been followed. Amoni stayed inside the house. She couldn't bear to watch Tayul chop down the rows of Sharon trees one by one, dig out their roots. It was a difficult job. The trees were old and their roots reached deeply into the ground. I helped him by dragging the fallen trees to the corner of the yard where they'd burn later. Tayul had reached the last tree, a small one that Amoni had planted a few days before. As he began to dig, Amoni came out from the house and said, "Tayul, wait. First, go fetch a big pot or basin or something." "What kind of a pot?" "I don't know. It needs to be big." "Oh, wait, where you keep the tools. There's an old ceramic pot with a crack in it. That will do." I helped Tayul carry the pot to her. It was quite large, and large around my two arms could make in a circle. "Now," Noni placed the last little tree, "dig a circle and be careful not to cut any of the roots. I want you to bring the whole root ball out of the ground." This took a long time. Tayul had to use an axe to chop up the roots of the other trees to make it easier to dig them out. Now he can only use one shovel. Amoni returned to the house, but she came from time to time to watch him work. At last he put down the shovel and wiped his brow. "I think I can get it out now," he said. Although he had been the smallest tree, it was nearly as tall as me. Tayul pulled carefully in the hole and laid it on the ground. "Amoni," I called. She came again and parted Tayul's shoulder. "You did a good job," she said. She walked around the little tree. "I think you'll need to cut off about this much." She pointed to a spot about a third of the way down from the top. While Tayul chopped away with the axe, Amoni took up the shovel and began to fill the ceramic pot with dirt from where the trees had been dug up. Now I knew what she was doing. I got a trowel from the top shelf and helped scoop dirt into the pot. Amoni and Tayul lifted the little tree and settled it in the pot. Then we packed more dirt and mulch around it. Finally, I fetched a basin of water and gave the tree a drink. The three of us stepped back and looked at the tree and at each other. We were tired and dirty, but we managed to smile. We'd hardly spoken throughout the entire task, yet we had all known what to do. It felt good to have done this together. At the same time, I was troubled. Amoni was breaking the law. If she got caught, if the guards discovered the little tree, what would happen? Would she be arrested? A cold wind blew through me. I was afraid for her, but I was proud for her too. How could I be proud of my mother for breaking the law? I shook my head, trying to clear it of these confusing thoughts and looking at Amoni again. She was watching as Tayul lifted the heavy pot onto an old burlap sack. There was something in her face that I hadn't seen before. I didn't often think about what my parents looked like. They looked like my parents, that's all. But sometimes when she was sitting calmly, sewing on the pale light near the window, I could see that Amoni was pretty. Her face was now round, then oval, and she had lovely clear skin. She wore her long hair braided and coiled in a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Sometimes at night, when she took it down, she let me brush it. I loved doing that. My own hair had been cut short, chin length with bangs, and when I started school, it was because of the required hairstyle. Each of Amoni's eyelids had a delicate fold in it. This was unusual. It was considered a trait of luck and beauty. My eyelids had folds, too. Because of them, and maybe because I was girl, I thought I looked more like Amoni than Abdul and Tayul, just like Abdul looked both tall and thin. Now, Amoni had a firm expression on her face, almost stubborn. Maybe she was afraid too, but she wasn't letting it show. Tayul dragged the sack and pots across the garden to the house. He paused and looked, and then put the tree and pot on the shelves. There's plenty of stuff here, he said. If we need to, we can put all the trees in it and hide it. I looked around anxiously and saw a few old sacks in the corner. I picked them up and dragged them carefully over to the tree. Tayul took a rotten straw basket and some pieces of wood and leaned it against the pot. It was a good disguise. The tree now looked like a pile of old junk. Good, Amoni said and smiled at both of us. Later that afternoon, the soldiers came around to inspect our yard. I was weeding the vegetable garden and held my breath as they walked in. For a few minutes, they stood and watched. Tayul at the work, burning a huge pile of rose Sharon trees. And then they nodded at each other and marched off. I let out a whoop and a whoosh. The little tree in its pot amid the workshop clatter was safe. Amoni took even better care than she did of the garden. Once I heard her murmuring quietly as she pored over it and was around. The time will come, she said to the tree, when you will be free to grow in a place of honor. Until then, I will see you live, and it's a promise. Truly, the Rose of Sharon trees are not as beautiful as cherry trees. But if the little tree was ever planted outside again, I knew it would be the most beautiful tree in the world.